On that very Tuesday afternoon, Lynn Marchmont went for a long walk. With a growing sense of anxiety and dissatisfaction within herself, she felt the need to think through these matters alone and work them out by reflecting on them. She hadn't seen Rowley for a few days, after their somewhat stormy encounter that morning, when she asked him to lend her £5. They had met as usual. Lynn realized her request was unreasonable, and Rowley was entirely right to refuse, but reasonableness was never a trait favored by lovers. Their relationship appeared to be as it always was on the surface, but internally, Lynn was uncertain about the state of things. The past few days had felt unbearably monotonous, and yet she was reluctant to admit to herself that David Hunter's sudden move to London with his sister might be related to her feelings of discontent. She admitted to herself with some melancholy that David was an intriguing person. As for her relatives, she felt at this moment that they were all frivolous and exhausting. Her mother was in her best mood, and at lunch that day, she troubled Lynn by announcing that she was trying to find a second gardener, saying, "Old gardener can't keep up with things around here." Lynn exclaimed in surprise, "But we can't afford to hire another gardener, dear." "You're mistaken, Lynn. I really think that gardener would be very upset if he saw how the garden had deteriorated. He was always very particular about the appearance of the trees and the regularity of the lawn, and the organization of the paths. But now, look at how it all has become. I feel that Gordon would have wanted to organize it again, even if we have to borrow money from his widow to do it. I told you, Lynn." Rosalind was very understanding about it. "I really think she understood my point of view. My account is fine now at the bank after paying all the bills, and I truly believe that a second gardener would be a saving factor. Just think of what additional vegetables he could plant. We could buy more vegetables than we can grow for a much lower amount than the additional £3 a week for a new gardener. But I doubt you'll find a gardener at that rate, dear. Many men are being discharged from military service now and are looking for work. That's what the papers say." Lynn said curtly, "I doubt you'll find them in Wormsley, a small village, or even in the Wormsley area at all." Although the matter ended there, her mother's tendency to rely on Rosalind as a regular source of support remained a haunting concern for Lynn. It reminded her of David's sarcastic remarks. As a result of her frustration and sour mood, she set off on her walk to clear her troubled mind. Her mood did not improve when she encountered Aunt Katy outside the post office. Aunt Katy seemed upbeat and high-spirited, and she immediately said, "I think, dear Lynn, we will soon receive good news." "What on earth do you mean, Aunt Katy?" Aunt Katy shook her head and smiled with a feigned wisdom, saying, "I've made some truly amazing contacts. Expect a simple happy ending to all our efforts. My efforts faced one setback, but then I received a message urging me to try again. Even if I didn't succeed at first, I won't give away any secrets, dear Lynn. The last thing I want is to raise false hopes too soon, but I truly believe that things will be all right very soon. I'm very worried about your uncle. He worked so hard during the party. He really needs to retire and dedicate himself to his specialized studies, but of course, he can't do that without a proper income. He sometimes has very strange nervous fits. I'm very worried about him. He's really eccentric." Lynn shook her head, lost in thought. She had noticed the change in Lionel Claude and the strange shift in his moods. She suspected he might be using drugs to stimulate himself, wondering if he had become addicted to some extent, which would explain his severe nervousness. She pondered how much Aunt Katy knew or suspected, as Lynn considered Aunt Katy was not as foolish as she appeared. As she walked along High Street, she spotted her uncle entering his house and saw that he looked much older than his actual age in these past 3 weeks alone. She quickened her pace, wanting to leave Wormsley and reach the hills and open country. When she reached the open space, she felt somewhat better after a long walk of 6 or 7 miles, thinking deeply about her life. Throughout her life, she had always been decisive, clear-minded, and knew what she wanted and didn't want. However, she had never been content to let circumstances push her where they wished. Yes, that was the essence of the issue, living aimlessly and following a way of life without goals or form since she had finished her military service. She was overtaken by a wave of nostalgia for the war days, where duties were clear and well-defined, where life was planned and organized, and where the burden of making individual decisions was removed. But even as she entertained this thought, she was horrified by herself. Was that really and truly what people everywhere felt once in a while? Was this what the war inevitably did to people? The problem wasn't in the material dangers of military service, such as naval mines, falling bombs, or the buzz of a bullet while driving a vehicle in the desert. The significance lay in the spiritual danger of learning how easy life could be if one stopped thinking. After joining the army, Lynn was no longer the firm, intelligent, clear-headed person she used to be. Her mind had undergone a specialized process, channeled into precise paths. Now that she was once again in control of her own life, she was facing the frightening challenge of addressing her personal problems and handling them. With a sudden, grim smile, Lynn thought to herself, "It's strange if the newspaper's description is accurate, the home front women who achieved themselves through wartime conditions, those who faced thousands of prohibitions without any allowances, who had to plan, think, and innovate, and use every bit of the genius God gave them, developing a genius they didn't even know they possessed." Lynn now saw that these women were perhaps the only ones who could stand tall without crutches, responsible for themselves and others in a way that demanded precision and diligence. Lynn was pondering the circumstances of the year 20, and what about those who stayed at home in the country, like Raleigh? But soon Lynn's mind shifted from the obscure and mysterious world to the direct and mechanical person that Raleigh was. That was the problem, the real and only problem. Did she really want to marry Raleigh? Little by little, the shadows grew longer, signaling dusk and sunset. She sat motionless, resting her chin in her hands at the edge of a grove on the hillside, gazing at the valley below. She had lost track of time but felt a strange hesitation about going to her home, White House, and farther down to the left was the Long Willows house, which would be between her and Raleigh if she married him. So it had come back to that tool. If. A bird flew out from the grove, emitting a cry like a spoiled child's, and a puff of smoke from one of the trains began to twist in the sky, forming a huge question mark. 4420. Should I marry Raleigh? Do I want to marry Raleigh? Did I ever want to marry Raleigh? Can I endure not marrying Raleigh? The train's smoke drifted away in the valley, and the question mark in Lynn's mind did not fade. She had loved Raleigh before she left, but she told herself, "I have returned home, and I have changed. I am no longer the same girl," and a line of poetry came to her mind. Life in the world and I have changed, but what about Raleigh? Raleigh then changes too. Yes, that's true. Raleigh hasn't changed and I found him where I left him 4 years ago. Do I want to marry Raleigh? If not, then what do I want? The branches in the grove rustled behind her, and she heard a man's voice say, "Lynn," as he made his way through the underbrush. Lynn cried, "David?" David looked at her, astonished, as he approached through the thickets and said, "What are you doing here, for heaven's sake?" He was slightly out of breath as he had been running. She said, "I don't know, I'm just thinking, sitting here, thinking." Late. She shrugged in confusion and added, "I'd like to know what time it is. Don't you have any idea what time it is?" She looked absent-mindedly at her stopped watch and said, "It's stopped again. I often break watches." "And you break more than watches. It's the energy inside you, vitality, life." He moved closer, and she felt an awkward discomfort. He said, "It's getting dark. I should hurry home. What time is it, David?" 9:15. "I have to run like a rabbit to catch the 9 o'clock train to London." "I didn't know you had come back here." "I had to get some things from Forabank's house, but I need to catch this train. Rosalind is alone in the flat, and she'll lose her mind if she's alone at night in London." Even in a flat within a managed and serviced complex? Is there a hint of disdain in Lynn's voice? David replied sharply, "Fear doesn't follow logic, and when you go through such an experience." Lynn suddenly felt embarrassed and regretful. She said, "Sorry, I forgot. Good morning, David." With a sudden bitterness, she thought, "Yes, soon I'll forget everything and return to safety, to domestication, to the tamed life, return to where we were when the show began. All of it crawls back into our little nest, affecting safety again. And you, Lynn, are just like the rest." She exclaimed, "Just like them? I'm not like them, David, not now, with you and Raleigh. I'm thinking." Her speed began to enclose her, and he said, "Raleigh Claude? That fool? For heaven's sake, Lynn. You are mine." Then he suddenly left her with the same speed he had embraced her, as if throwing her away from him, saying, "The train," and he ran swiftly down the hillside. She watched him run through the growing darkness, lightly, gracefully, and then walked slowly towards home, feeling oddly disturbed and confused. She hesitated a little before entering the house, feeling displeased with her mother's warm reception and her questions. Her mother. who had borrowed £5 from people she despised. And Lynn thought as she climbed the stairs slowly, we have no right to despise Rosalind and David. We are just like them, ready to do anything, anything for money. She stood in her bedroom, looking curiously and strangely at her face in the mirror. She saw a face that seemed like a stranger's. Suddenly, she was seized by anger and said to herself, if Raleigh really loved me, he would have saved any portion of those £500 somehow. Yes, he would have saved them, and wouldn't have left me insulted by having to take it from David. David said he would call her when he got to London. She descended to the lower floor, walking dreamily, thinking that dreams could be very dangerous things. Adele's cheerful voice called out, "Ah, there you are, Lynn. I didn't hear you come in, my dear. Have you been back long?" "Yes, a long time. Were you upstairs?" "I wish you had told me when you came back, Lynn. I get so nervous when you go out alone and are late after dark." "What is it, Mother? Don't you think I can take care of myself?" Lynn said, with a hint of irritation. "The newspapers have been full of scary stories lately. All those discharged soldiers, they're attacking girls. I suppose girls are really asking for it." She smiled a smile that revealed her teeth. "Yes, girls are indeed seeking danger. And who wants to be safe, anyway? Lynn, my dear, are you listening?" Her mind wandered to Raleigh's broad, handsome face, his slow smile, and his healthy look. But she wondered, does Raleigh really care for her? If he truly cared, he would have understood her situation that day when she pleaded for £5. He would have understood her position instead of showing that practicality and realism that almost drove her mad. Marrying Raleigh means living on the farm, never traveling again, never seeing foreign lands, never being free again. The phone rang sharply. Lynn took a deep breath and walked into the living room, picked up the receiver, and was taken aback by the voice of Aunt Kelly on the other end. "Lynn, is that you? Oh, how happy I am. I'm afraid I may have messed up the arrangements for the meeting at the Institute." With a sharp, anxious tone, Lynn muted the call and made appropriate objections and confirmations, offering thanks. "It's a great relief, dear Lynn, to have you always in this state and so practical. I really can't imagine how the arrangements were messed up." Aunt Kelly's talent for confusion was almost genius. Lynn ended the call and said, "I always say that things fail and get complicated all at once, a broken phone line, and now I have to go out to a public phone, and I don't have enough change for the call. And so I have to go and ask." The call finally ended. Lynn put down the receiver and returned to the living room. She cautiously asked Adela Marchmont who was calling. "Auntie Connie? What did she want?" Oh, it was just another of her stories. Lynn sat down again, holding a book, and looked at the wall clock. Yes, it was still early. It wasn't yet time for her call at 11:15. The phone rang again. "Hello, this is Lynn Marchmont. Can Miss Lynn Marchmont receive a personal call from London?" Her heart skipped a beat. She said, "This is Miss Lynn Marchmont speaking. One moment, please." She waited. On the line were overlapping voices, then silence. The phone service was getting worse day by day. She waited, then picked up the receiver in frustration. Afterward, another female voice came on, cold and indifferent. "Please hang up, we'll call you back later." She hung up and returned to the living room, but the phone rang again as she was by the door. She rushed back to the phone. "Hello?" A man's voice said, "This is Lynn Marchmont, personal call from London." "This is Miss Lynn Marchmont speaking." "One moment, please, speaking from London, the line is connected." Then suddenly, David Lynn's voice came through. "Is that you, David? I needed to talk to you. Listen, Lynn, I think it's best for me to leave." "What do you mean?" "Leave England entirely. Or, it's actually quite easy. I pretended in front of Rosalind that it was a difficult matter, but the truth is I simply didn't want to leave. But what's the point of it all? You and I won't work out. You're a lovely, gentle girl, Lynn, but I'm quite a scoundrel, and I've always been one. Don't delude yourself into thinking that I'll straighten out for you. Maybe I intended to straighten out, but it won't work. It's better for you to marry Raleigh, the hard-working one. He'll never give you a single day of worry throughout your life, whereas I'll give you hell." She stood there, holding the receiver, not saying anything. "Lynn, are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here." "You haven't said anything." "What is there to say?" "Lynn?" "Yes. It's strange how you can feel so clearly despite all this distance. His mood seemed to worsen. He muttered curses softly, then said explosively, "To hell with everything," and hung up the line. Mrs. Marchmont came out of the living room and asked, "Who was it?" "Wrong number." She quickly went upstairs.